Who likes getting graded? The answer? Those who are confident that they'll get a good score back. I wasn't too bad a student, so I never felt particularly anxious, but we're not talking about school, we're talking about video games. High scores have been around since pretty early on, and letter grades aren't anything new either. Even the Mega Man series has its fair share of these. From you increasing your Hunter rank in some of the X titles, and almost all encounters in Battle Network ranking your performance. I think the most infamous, though, would be the Zero titles, with not just how harsh and unforgiving they can be, but also some of the things that you can get penalized for. Why not pull up a guide, which I'll be linking in the description, and give the criteria a bit of a look, to try and decide just how reasonable or otherwise Indie Creates' expectations are, and whether it's all in good fun or a source of deep-rooted depression for players. I'm Wes, the Explosion, and I tend to hover around rank B in case you're wondering. Right at the top is mission completion, which is a fifth of your score. I like how this gives more context to what you're trying to accomplish in these games, rather than your goal just being to go from left to right. The X series played around with this a bit, giving an absurdly brief description of the situation in each level in X4, having you do stuff like disarm bombs in X5 while also telling you exactly what item on your shopping list you were tracking down, and X6 and 7 mostly just had you saving random Reploids who didn't have the sense to stay off an active battleground. Here though, there's two ways the whole mission score can go. Some of them, you'll have to do a specific, missable task, like flipping a bunch of switches or destroying some computers. For others, you really do just have to complete the stage to get full marks. Oh, and I read that going into the cyber world in Z3 takes points from this. Makes sense, but it's a little awkward if you want to get that extra Phantom fight. I like the way things are split here. When there are extra objectives, it gives an extra challenge that you can choose whether to accept or not, and also keeps things interesting, since it throws in another element for you to play around with. And I always hate it when a game introduces a gimmick and then runs it into the ground, insisting on you using it even when it doesn't make sense. Them choosing when to toss in an extra assignment or not prevents it from feeling forced, and when there is something, it gives you the sense that they actually gave it some thought. Plus, by not being married to the concept, they can take it easy on you in some of the more important or challenging missions by not expecting you to juggle a side objective on top of everything else. As they say, all things in moderation. These strike a nice balance. You get the more standard stuff with clear time, damage taken, enemies killed, and retries. Time and kills vary from level to level, since some are longer than others and some are a bit more populous, but the guide I looked at said that if you just naturally destroy all the baddies you come across in a stage, you should get full marks. That's a really nice rule of thumb, and since we're talking about time as well, it'd be really messed up if you were expected to respawn some guys to meet your quota. Damage and retries go hand in hand, since if you need to use an extra life, you probably took a good bit of damage in the process. It is possible you could die from an insta-kill without taking any other damage though, which is kind of impressive in its own way. Still, neither of these allow for much wiggle room, so if you want a high score, you can't just do well, you need to be nigh flawless. A single hit will likely be enough to knock a point or two from your score. It's a tricky balancing act, since focusing on one could very easily mean you missing out on another. Trying to kill everything could lead to you taking a lot of damage. Being overly cautious to make sure you don't get hit could lead to you taking too much time. And trying to be a speedster is probably gonna lead to problems in all categories. While the rest of the criteria can all be seen as largely conscious choices, these four are entirely based on skill. Despite my brief explanation, they actually make up the majority of the points you can score. Unique to 04 is the weather. You can choose whether to go into a level under circumstances that are favorable to either you or the boss. While going in under bad conditions will make the level a bit harder to get through, the big thing is that it will give the boss a new move that you have to contend with. Be brave and bold and get a bit of a bump to your score, but the real reward is getting the extra EX skill that you can equip to your sword or buster. Previously, you needed to already have a high rank in order to get a shot at the EX skill, but letting you toggle the chance on and off depending on how frisky you feel is really nice, especially since this is the only way to unlock elemental attacks. I always go for these, and getting some extra points on top of it just feels like a bonus on top of a bonus. Then there's the Cyber Elves. Collect these things as you go through the game. You get them from enemies, from containers, to just clearing levels, so keep a sharp eye out and you'll find a ton. You use these in place of normal upgrades, to increase life and your physical abilities, as well as gain temporary boosts like healing or damaging enemies, to name a few. Of course, using them comes with some major caveats. It kills the Cyber Elves and it preys on your guild, as well as it completely tanks your score. They relax this more and more as things go along. The second game letting you collect some sub-tanks without sacking an elf, the third adding in satellite elves that can buff you without affecting your score, and the fourth getting rid of all of that, assigning you just a single elf that you can customize its loadout, and only subtracting points if you add on more abilities than its current level allows, each stage cleared adding one. Still though, it's pretty cool, letting you get all these upgrades and not letting you use any of them unless you can overcome guilt and pride. This might be one of the most infamous elements in the game. I remember reading an article back in the day, I believe on the Mega Man Network, that summed up the Zero series as giving you all the tools that you need to succeed, then making you feel terrible for doing so. And a recent review I watched from Some Call Me Johnny equated not using elves as essentially doing a challenge run, and yeah, I'd say both takes are pretty accurate. I sometimes will break down and use a few elves on the final bosses, though I've cleared all the games without needing to sacrifice any, but I'm not about to say that this isn't rough. Yeesh. Both cruel and unusual. As for the individual scores, 96 and above gets you S, with letter grades under that descending every 10 points. The whole playthrough works on an average, so if you're doing well, one bad stage won't tank your score, but conversely, if you find yourself in a hole, it can be really hard to crawl out of it. And each individual stage also nets you a title, based on how you did and with what. I tend to get Edge Boy with some sort of adjective. Early on, I was getting sluggish, as if my poor score wasn't enough to make me feel bad, though I've gotten Supreme Edge Boy since then. That second part sounds like a bit of an insult though, doesn't it? Calling me edgy while still treating me like a child? Of course I'm edgy. I'm playing Mega Man Zero rather than any of the less serious series, and these games are allegedly for children. I've also gotten stuff like Sniper, when I relied more on my Buster, and Warrior, when I guess I used more of a variety while racking up kills. And I'm sure there's plenty more that I've never seen, due to just not playing a certain way. Like how I tend to never use anything other than the two standard weapons. Regardless though, I love the personal touch that it adds to your assessment, at least when it's not being used to add insult to injury. So what are the pros, what are the cons? Well, the good things include all the obvious stuff, bragging rights as well as a tangible metric to mark your growth. I know my scores have definitely improved from a year ago. Not only that, but it can be used as a bit of a guide. While just a number wouldn't be helpful, the breakdown of your grade shows what you can work on, as well as highlighting where you're already doing a good job. While you'll probably still need a guide to pick up on all the nitty-gritty, this certainly does a wonderful job giving you a basic idea. And while I never thought about it too much, it is pretty interesting how your score is also affected a good deal by player choice. How thorough you complete a mission, elf use, and eventually weather accounting for about a third of your score, while the rest is all skill. I love options, especially when it comes to difficulty, and I'd say all three of these qualify in a sense. And as one other plus, I find it kinda funny when I fight through the entire game, including a final stage with a boss rush and multi-stage final encounter, only for the game to have the nerve to give me a D. Imagine Grant accepting the South's surrender, only for a letter to arrive giving him a low grade because some higher power thought that Washington could have done it better. And this of course brings up the major drawback to the whole system, just how damn discouraging it is. The Zero series is probably the most brutal of all the Mega Man games, at least when it comes to mainline. Getting through them all, a single game, heck, even just a standalone level is an accomplishment and should be a cause for celebration, yet early successes are met with a reminder of just how trash you are. It can feel outright contemptuous, as if the game's spitting on you as it gives you your score. There have been plenty of people who have been turned off by just how difficult the games are, but I wonder how many more, who had the skills to go the distance, might have dropped it just because of how harsh things were, even during victory. A shame since the games are mostly pretty great, and I wonder if ZX dropping the ranking system was part of an attempt to make the games more welcoming. Of course, since then, difficult and purposefully cruel games have certainly carved out a niche, and people who are easily discouraged off a mean game would likely give up at Aztec Falcon rather than the report card. So while I don't think the number of people who stop because of their rank is zero, at the same time, there's probably a good bit of overlap between the sort of person who would play through a tough-as-nails platformer and those looking to have a nice little certificate to show off just how good at the game they are. And while I certainly felt insulted when early runs told me that I just wasn't winning hard enough, these days, I like using my scores to measure improvement and get a feel for what I can do better. So, I approve of the system. I think the ranking does more good than harm, but there's still a small part of me that wishes newer players could be spared. While Save Assist and Casual Scenario do a ton to make the games accessible, had you asked me for early suggestions, I would have brought up the idea of adding in a beginner mode where the scores are turned off and maybe not framing you using Cyber Elves as killing them, but keep everything else the same. Let players get a feel for the game before expecting mastery and just let them play without being judged. But starting off with more health than some bosses certainly makes this less needed now. You know what? Maybe players with such a massive handicap don't need their ego stroked too, and it gives them something to strive for. So there you go. All that just for me to say that I think the rank scores in Mega Man Zero are good, even if they can be a bit of a jerk at times. I respect the system enough to the point that, when I start getting A's consistently, I plan on bumping up to hard mode, though I think I'm still a ways off from that. But hey, it's good to have goals. So how do other people feel about the game ranks? Is it neat, mean, generous, fair, unfair? Has it ever broken your spirit, or do you just do the same person thing and ignore it, since video games are meant to be a leisure activity, not a source of stress? That'll be it for this week, so a bit of a short one, but thanks as always for watching, and maybe consider subscribing if you're into Mega Man. Hell's Gate open!